Hey everyone, Hakaias here, and like many of you, I saw Star Wars Rise of Skywalker recently, and like many of you, I have some thoughts. So this isn't going to be a full review / analysis kind of thing, because there was really just one aspect of the movie that stood out to me as something I really wanted to talk about, something I'm really passionate about. If you read the title of this video, you already know what that is. Yes, today we're going to talk about how the Rise of Skywalker treats the subject of death. Now, if you saw my first From the Hawk's Eye video, you already know that I have some strong feelings about death in narratives. But if you haven't seen that, and you don't feel like going back to watch it right now, to summarize, I mostly think that it's overdone as a way to kind of puff up the stakes of a story, and I also think that character resurrection is perfectly fine in most cases. So as usual, I would recommend you go ahead and see the movie, form your own ideas before you watch this video. That way you can argue with me and tell me how stupid I am in the comments below. But whether you choose to do that or not, I do want to warn you that spoilers for The Rise of Skywalker, the entire movie, do follow in today's From the Hawk's Eye. So, I want to go over the 5 deaths. There are 5 deaths that really stood out the most in the narrative. So we'll just go over those in order of least important to most important. And what that means is we will start with the death of Snap Wexley. Some of you, maybe all of you, are asking who Snap Wexley is right now. Perhaps you'd know the character better by his actor's name, Greg Grunberg. If you don't know who that is, I mean, well, he's on your screen right now. I can't really do much for you beyond that. Just hit up Google, I guess. I promise he was in the movie, just in case you forgot him. He dies towards the end of the film, right before Lando arrives with the reinforcements. So this death kind of occurs as a way to make the situation seem as hopeless as possible, and to give kind of the night is darkest just before the dawn feel to the tension of this moment in the movie. So this, despite my earlier declarations on the subject, it's fine. It's not like Snap is a real character in the story. I literally only know his character name because I googled Greg Grunberg Star Wars. His role was always going to be a guy who you kind of sort of recognize, to whom things happen to help set the tone. Killing him to help drive home how bad the situation is for the Resistance at this point is essentially why he exists in the first place. That being said, I don't really like it, but I am willing to admit that this death falls much more under the auspices of personal preference than objectivity. I do think it's a teensy bit on the nose in driving that point home, but given Star Wars history as a melodrama, it's not an unwarranted choice, so there's really no problem there. Then we have C-3PO. You can debate all you want about whether droids are alive or not. It doesn't really matter, because the narrative wants us to see this as a character death. And what the narrative wants, the narrative gets in this case. But shortly before he dies, the characters just go ahead and admit that he's not gonna stay dead. They talk about how R2-D2 has a memory backup. Now, C-3PO tries to complain that R2-D2's memory backups are unreliable, but we all know that isn't going to be true. It's never been true. He's always talked about how unreliable R2-D2 is, and he's never been unreliable. And then once you bring up the idea that C-3PO's memory can be backed up the same way that we're used to computer storage being backed up in our own daily lives, it becomes unclear why Babu Frick doesn't just back him up, or just take the illegal data out of his memory, copy that out, and just do that on a computer somewhere that doesn't matter. But the real problem here is that they try to have their cake and eat it too, to use a weird and broken metaphor. So they throw a couple of moments of sentimentality in, but they're entirely undercut by the confirmation that he won't stay dead. and the fact that beyond those couple of beats of sentimentality, everything else surrounding the situation is played for laughs. So, what this does is it can make it harder to be invested in the rest of the story, because when you can't be sure whether this plot point matters or not, it reduces your ability to feel confident about which of the other plot points matter. Next up, we have the death of General Leia Organa. I think many of us expected this death, given Carrie Fisher's death prior to the film's completion. Not to sound insensitive to her or family, believe me, I was plenty sad when I heard the news, but her death did put this film in an awkward position. They were left with essentially two choices: cut her out entirely and try to justify that without making it weird, and then create a whole new story that didn't include her character, or include her in the form of body doubles, CGI, and previously unused footage. They chose the latter, and after having seen the movie, I'm not convinced that was the right call. You can absolutely see how it forces changes and added difficulty to the other actors, to the creation of the narrative, and to the filming process. Someone could probably do an entire video just on that aspect of the movie. But for our purposes today, it did result in a moment where, after ignoring her for a good chunk of the movie, it just stops suddenly in the middle of a climactic lightsaber battle on another planet between the two main characters, so that someone can narrate her death like they're narrating a nature documentary. And because they're using a body double in this scene and can't show her face, we don't even get a sense of Leia's emotions or thoughts as she walks off to just lie down and die. It's bizarre, and it completely takes you out of the moment. It seems likely that the original plan was for her to do some sort of force astral projection like Luke did back in the last movie, and she would have done this to communicate with Kylo Ren and convince him to come back to the light side. But because they couldn't do that, they just had to have her give up and die so that Kylo Ren and Rey could sense her death, and then it would affect their duel and their actions immediately following. So while it's important to understand the circumstances and the constraints they were working under with this death, even given that context, it's not great. There's little to no foreshadowing that she will die or has any interest in reaching out to Kylo Ren one last time. Heck, her tiny character arc from the previous movie involves her coming to finally accept that her son is dead. Remember, in The Force Awakens, she tells Han Solo, "Bring him home," and then in that movie, she finally, at the end of the movie, tells Luke Skywalker, "Do what you gotta do. I understand my son is dead. We've got to move on from this point." And then in this movie, we don't see her, and oh no, she's gonna die to bring her son back to the light. So the problems with the Rise of Skywalker, how it treats her death, are more in execution than intent, even though there are some issues with the intent that I just outlined. So I'll give them credit for trying to do something more interesting with her death than they might have otherwise done, but you gotta take it back and then take some interest because of the lousy execution. Next up, we have the deaths of Kylo Ren and Ben Solo. So despite the fact that there was only one literal death between them, and they're really the same person, I did want to go ahead and talk about both the figurative and literal deaths involved here, because neither is what I'd call a great example of what I think they hoped to accomplish. So Kylo Ren dies when Ben decides to choose the light side. The scene he has with Han where this occurs is one of the best moments in the movie, but like a lot of the rest of the movie, there's no foreshadowing that any of this is coming. Kylo Ren has doubled down on being evil since his near brush with repenting in the last film, and then suddenly, because his mom is dead and the girl he likes stabbed him through the gut but then healed the wound, he remembers his dad and has a conversation with the memory and repents of his evil ways. Like far too many things in this film, it just poof happens. And then at the end of the movie, Ben Solo dies because the redemption equals death trope reigns supreme. And, well, no, that's it. That's the only reason. Yes, I understand what the movie wants me to understand. He performs a force healing on Rey to save her, and it uses up too much of his life energy, and he dies. But we have so little information on force healing that literally anything could have happened, and it would have made sense to the audience with approximately the same amount of inference, which means he died because the creators wanted him to die. just like he survived his TIE fighter crash earlier in the movie because the writers wanted him to. Plus, dying just to fulfill a trope is not exactly good writing, especially when the only reason that trope exists is to A, perpetuate the idea that punishment is the most important thing to happen when someone does a bad thing, and B, saves the writers from making any effort to incorporate this newly redeemed person into the group to which they have long been opposed. It's hacky, and I hate it. Finally, now we're ready to talk about the biggest and most important death in the Rise of Skywalker. Emperor Palpatine. No, not the one at the very end of the movie. The issue is actually the one in Return of the Jedi, or rather, how it's undone for this movie. I've said before that character resurrection doesn't have to be a bad thing, and I stand by that. But this movie actually provides a really good example of how it can be really bad. There are two important things to keep in mind, at least two important things to keep in mind when doing a character resurrection. The first is, do I have strong story stakes outside of death? For example, Dragon Ball Z features loads of character resurrections, but the stakes of that story don't exist in whether or not those characters stay dead. The real stakes are in who will ultimately win the fight, and how many episodes it will take them to do it. All a character death in that show establishes is that that person will not be the winner of this particular fight. The second thing to consider is whether you've properly foreshadowed the resurrection so that when it happens, it feels like an inevitable result of character actions, especially if the stakes of the story rely on characters dying or living. Inevitability is key here. If a character resurrection does not feel like an inevitable result, then it can feel inauthentic. An inauthentic character resurrection leads to lost stakes and audience fear that the entire story is meaningless. And that's what happens here. Palpatine's resurrection comes with absolutely zero foreshadowing. There isn't even a tiny bit of foreshadowing in the movie itself, as the very first lines of the opening crawl declare his new presence. His return, I guess I should say. The very first scene is a confrontation between him and Kylo Ren. If there is such a thing as negative foreshadowing, this is it. So like I just said, this is an excellent example of all of the things that could go wrong with a character resurrection. And what I mean by that is that we can see all of the negative consequences of one that's poorly done. In this case, because the resurrection of Palpatine adds almost nothing to the story and is entirely unforeseeable beyond marketing materials, which do not count for the purposes of storytelling, the big climax of the movie, Rey defeating Palpatine, is entirely lacking in said climax. He's there just because, and that means his removal feels similarly meaningless. Further, because we've seen him come back for no reason and with no warning, there's no finality to it. Think about it. When he dies in Return of the Jedi, it feels like this massive victory, and the galaxy seems like it will finally be safe. When he dies in Rise of Skywalker, it's more of a collective shrug as everyone continues doing their thing because they have no control over whether or not he might return. His presence casts a pall over the entire film and drains much of the tension because it makes it clear that the writers will do whatever they want in the service of any random thing they happen to think sounds good. Why should the audience care about what's happening if any of it can be done and can be undone at any moment for little to no reason? And of course, so many other things are undone by this movie that their worst fears end up being confirmed. But it all starts with Palpatine's resurrection. Before this video ends, I just wanted to go over some of the good things about this movie, lest we forget that it does have some redeeming qualities. Some people are going to enjoy this movie, and there's no benefit to making them feel bad about it. Here are some positives to keep in mind when talking to someone who really enjoyed this movie. Ian McDiarmid's performance as Palpatine is entertaining as heck. It's clear he loves that role with his entire being, and you've always got to respect someone who is willing to go that far over the top in service of bringing their role to life. Babu Frick, the droid hacker, is a joy whenever he's on screen. He literally made me just super happy to be in the audience watching this movie. He made the whole thing worth it for me. If all you take away from that movie is Babu Frick is awesome, you've done enough. The improvised or not, that scene between Han Solo and Kylo Ren is just so well acted and exists as such an excellent mirror reflection of their scene together in The Force Awakens that it literally gave me goosebumps. It was really terrific. And, the chemistry between John Boyega's Finn and Oscar Isaac's Poe Dameron is incredibly delightful. Even though it does not lead to the on-screen romance many people were hoping for, it's just fun to watch them, banter back and forth together. And again, it's one of those things that just provides a sense of joy and happiness in this movie, even if you feel like the rest of it is kind of falling apart around itself. So yeah, there were some bright moments in this movie, but they definitely did not get death right. It's far too trivialized, and that steals so much of the tension from the movie. Just hopefully future Star Wars movies and TV series will be better planned out, and that will allow them to make stronger choices, which will result in better stories. We've already seen this with The Mandalorian, which the whole first season is it's great, and hopefully it will continue to be so, and we've got a couple more series coming that hopefully will provide more of the same. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Whether you agree with me or disagree with me, I hope it made you think a little bit, and I do want to hear your thoughts down in those comments. Hit me up, let me know. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Until next time, may the Force be with you, and may all of your paths be paved with hexagonal stones. And this is the part where I do a quick shout out to all of my beautiful patrons. Go to my Patreon, linked in the description below, and sign up for as little as $1 a month to join them in helping me make more videos like this.